I noticed that a lot of people on Reddit were confused about what I was actually talking about, so here it is. Here's my explanation of the layers of internalization that especially autistic people go through, but oftentimes it's not just autistic people.
C'est pas marrant, tu sais, la vie sans toi. C'est pas marrant, tu sais, la vie chez moi.
Regarding the relationship between constructionism and deconstructionism, I already explained it in another video. And as for the future stages, they're pretty self-explanatory, so I won't go over most of them, but I'll make two exceptions. The philosophical language layer is meant to describe philosophical language or the autistic use of philosophical language. So it's not specifically for autistic people, but some people say that Lojban is better for autistic people in terms of actually being able to communicate and understand it. And a lot of autistic people, especially in r/ASD Republic, are using Esperanto to get over the language barrier. Although Esperanto itself isn't a philosophical language, it is certainly a very radical concept. As for schizoautisticism, it's basically any advocation for the combination of autistic and schizotypal ways of thinking, or for matter, any cluster A type of neurointelligence. I don't even know how to describe this, but the best definition for this, what I'm trying to describe here, is the disbelief in the importance of cause and effect. So, if you're telling a story, not all art has to have a definite story. Not all art has to have a story that is clearly interpretable, or at least interpreted easily. But all stories need to have cause and effect, so if you're thinking in therefores and not cause and effect, then you've definitely internalized this. And there are obvious examples where things just, happen, but there are also examples that do have cause and effect relationships, at least for the most part, but kind of disregard them. For example, in the most recent Star Wars films, specifically 7 to 9, Luke Skywalker is no longer the adventurous guy that he was before. He isn't teaching anyone, he's not fighting any battles, or at least he hasn't been fighting any battles. He's not trying to be a master. He's just kinda there. The reason he is like this is because he screwed up. He thought Kylo Ren was inevitably going to be evil and tried to kill him, and Kylo Ren saw. But this is Luke Skywalker, who saved the galaxy multiple times. I think he would put a little more effort into what he did in the future than just leave. Actually, weird is the wrong diction here, because it's just flat out bad. It replaces the original message with this idea that everything you'll do will just be meaningless if you make one simple mistake. The new Star Wars movies are also a good example, because I know that at least the first one is more or less a ripoff of the original Star Wars movie, the first one of the new trilogy, that is. And it shows that you don't have to actually take out the cause and effect. You just have to make cause and effect irrelevant compared to everything else. Now, I drew this to be pretty thin because I see this as still developing, and so far I don't see that many people internalizing it, at least not to a dangerous extent or effective extent. But if it does, then that can be very disastrous for everyone because, first of all, art will be reduced to entertainment, and entertainment will be reduced to pornography by virtue of no longer having what stories have to, make them stories. We could also see an unprecedented level of learned helplessness since people no longer think that things do anything. And it's already hit our generation, and it has hit a lot of autistic people with the whole ABA thing, but this could be even worse than that. Colloquially, I also called it Family Guyism, which should be more of a nickname than anything else, but I nickname it that because Family Guy is infamous for indulging in this with the whole cutaway gag thing, and I'm not saying that Family Guy is such a bad show, at least not the earlier seasons, and I'm not gonna say that Seth MacFarlane had any malicious intent either, but in effect it is contributing to the... But in effect, it may be one of the earliest shows to contribute to this. Now, I think the connection between the three of them is pretty self-explanatory, so I won't talk that much about it, but I will say that the effect is not so much cultural, at least not directly, because while there is definitely an effect on culture, most certainly it makes the culture more internationalist, the effect is more so indirect because of the system and lifestyle that this, or rather these types of economies provide. The neoliberal economy is very good at providing luxuries and such, but it's going to be very difficult because the people who have such luxuries aren't going to have the same wisdoms as, say, the Africans, or, for that matter, their great-grandfather. Now, I'm going to be relatively brief on this because I talk about this a lot, but essentially it is so omnipresent, yet it threatens the very existence of autistic people by virtue of not having nearly the same values. Like, they want autistic people to go extinct, autistic people want to, not go extinct, and they don't care much for whether autistic people have children, families, anything like that. They don't care whether or not you have friends in some cases even, and they very rarely care about whether or not you have high but stable income, but that's more so because capitalism is always looking for more production, and as of now at least, jobs are necessary for that. They have and are constantly meddling in autistic self-perception so that autistic people don't make an actual culture. They don't even want to entertain. In fact, they want to suppress the idea that autistic people can make society, culture, and language. You know how a lot of pseudo-intellectuals and white supremacists like to use the term cultural Marxism? Well, I don't like to use that term. Instead, I think a better term to describe today's problems is cultural Keynesianism. The cultural aspects which are necessary to maintain a consumerist or Keynesian system. It's the capitalists who run the media, the capitalists who literally own the means of production. I've also included the Disney adult mentality here because some people describe it as a sort of pseudo-religion, but regardless, I think it is definitely affecting the culture because it gives off this mentality, or heck, maybe it even started the mentality that the end of history is already over, that we don't need to do anything about the political, economic, or social system. And especially done through heavy consumerism and lack of pain, lack of moral agency. Like if you look at the Disneyland and all that stuff, it's also perfect. It's also Disney, also conflictless. There aren't even workers, which, a little capitalist there. As a matter of fact, you can't even see the workers putting stuff in the stores or anything like that, and I think you can all guess where that came from. Industrialism is what I used to describe the effects the Industrial Revolution has had on culture, how culture has changed because of it. And I've also included scientific racism, aside from happening, or quote-unquote scientific racism, aside from happening around the same time. The connection I think I was trying to make was that both of these take a very reductionist view on humanity. Like, in the case of scientific racism, quote-unquote scientific racism, people are reduced to their complexion, their skin color in some cases. And industrialism wants to, or tends to, in effect, reduce people into numbers by focusing so much on industrialist capitalism. Looking back, it probably wouldn't have hurt to put these two things in separate categories, but something to keep in mind about both is that, well, they refer to much older time periods. In fact, this is actually true for all of them, but especially this is relevant to the modern day because, well, most people don't believe in scientific racism, or as it's now being branded, quote-unquote race realism, quotes on the realism part. It still affects minorities. It still creates stratification that didn't need to happen. In fact, the racism of the late 19th century was probably the thing that inspired the modern race, quote-unquote realism, and the autism awareness ideology, evident by the fact that they use the aesthetic of science, but are really just there to push a racist and capitalist agenda. Now, it's worth noting that none of these are necessarily good or bad. They're not all bad, and they're not all good. They just all stray from nature, even if they do have a lot of merit and do a lot of good for people. So, the Enlightenment is pretty good in my opinion, and the liberal ideology did get some good things done, or at least good things were done under it. But I do nonetheless believe that they are especially unnatural. Now, it's better for humanity to think reasonably, to think logically, to the extent that's possible, but it's pretty hard to achieve, as you can see with, like, QAnon and anti-vaxxerism. And as for liberalism, I don't think it's natural to have a very individualist society. I think that people inevitably lean towards not necessarily very collectivist societies, but bigger families and stuff like that. And at least in my opinion as an autistic person, this is also true for autistic people. The axial age is essentially the era in which almost all of the main philosophies and religions began. So like Buddhism, Confucianism, Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and I'd also count Islam here, but I don't think it's in the same time period, but it is definitely, at the very least, influenced by the axial age religions. This is arguably one of the biggest ones because this is the point where the morals of humanity started to see a major shift. And I don't want to say that the world before it was moralless necessarily, but it made morality a lot more widespread and universal. I don't want to say the people before were without morality, but your morals probably came from at least one of these religions. Now, obviously, agriculture has been good, at least in the long term, but it has also been the origin of modern warfare, modern states. Like, it used to be a bunch of chieftains, but now you have these organized governments and states. It was the beginning of the modern hierarchies, and I say modern, which is going to be weird to most people because this happened like 12,000 years ago, but if you look at the actual age of humanity itself, it is pretty modern if you compare the two. For most people, this is the biggest lifestyle change, one which defined basically every society, or at least had a big, to say big impact would be quite inappropriate actually, because, well, almost none, pretty much none of the societies, except for like tribal societies, would exist without agriculture. And I don't think there's been one society that has deinternalized some of the negative attributes, the negative aspects of agricultural culture. While the autism awareness ideology is the most toxic thing to internalize, or at least one of the most toxic things to internalize, it's not actually what affects autistic people the most. Instead, it is neurotypical society. And this is because of double empathy, which essentially means that, or at least it's akin to, speaking a different language, and you're genetically predisposed to speak a certain language. So, autistic people can understand neurotypicals and other neurotypes. It's just that it's a lot harder to, it's a lot more unnatural for autistic people because society is so adapted for neurotypicals instead. And I don't want to paint neurotypical society itself as bad, but for autistic people, this is where at least a lot of disability comes from. Some autistic people are more affected than others, but it's definitely unnatural to communicate with neurotypicals, so autistic people as a whole have a disadvantage in that. And if you think about it, it does also affect development. Not to say that you can't have a good life under neurotypical society, but it's worth being aware that Autistic people don't inherently have difficulties with communication. It's just because autistic people don't have a society that autistic people do struggle with communication difficulties. But for all we know, autistic people could actually be more social and be better at communicating. Now, all of these should show how much we really don't know about the world, but this one is so interwoven with what we would call nature that I was hesitant to put this in at all. In a sense, nature has created the ability to abstract, and the ability to abstract created modern human nature. If you think back to 2 million years ago, there was some point, or maybe even before 2 million years ago, we don't know yet, but some point in human history, there was a time when what we would call humanity or pre-humanity were unable to make the abstractions or collective learning, and at some point, by process of natural selection, it was given by nature. And this also goes vice versa, because the ability to abstract could have led to, for example, eugenics. Not to say that eugenics is good or anything like that. Certainly not the modern eugenics, but let's say that the Neanderthals or Homo sapiens did a lot of eugenics on themselves, and that's what created the modern mind. So in that case, it would be something so old and close to the origin of humanity that it's sort of mixed in with nature, or it seems like that way. I will, however, say that especially abstract thinking is unnatural, and people should be aware of that, because reality is always more complex than it actually seems to be. This is not to suggest that any neurotype is superior to the other. I'm just pointing out the fact that abstract thinking can be a method of internalization that is very underestimated. It can oversimplify the actual situation, but at the same time, it is how you come up with new things, new ideas, new way to see old things. I hope this at least clears up some confusion, but if you're still curious as to what deinternalizing and overinternalizing mean, I made a video specifically about those concepts. The link is in the description. This is Autistic signing out.